The HOA president was standing in my yard, screeching into her dead phone, surrounded by men in suits with laptops that wouldn't load. Why? Because I dug up the fiber optic line they buried through my property without asking and mailed them a $12,000 repair invoice, with a smile. Oh, and I CC'd the county. Want to know how it got this far? Buckle up. It started, as most disasters do, quietly, with paperwork I never received. It was a typical Tuesday morning. I was barefoot on the lawn, coffee in hand, inspecting a stubborn patch of crabgrass that refused to die. That's when I saw them. Tiny plastic flags in orange, yellow, and blue, sticking out of the grass like party decorations for utility companies. I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't approved anything. And I sure as hell hadn't invited anyone to dig through my yard. By noon, trucks had shown up in my driveway. Not city trucks. Not even utility-branded ones. Just two plain white vans with a generic logo and a crew unloading what looked suspiciously like trenching equipment. Naturally, I asked what was going on. They ignored me. I walked over, polite at first. Hey, what are you guys doing here? One guy glanced at me, gave a tight-lipped smile, and said, Just following orders, sir, before slipping on his headphones and walking off like I was some confused old man yelling at clouds. They had already started tearing a line through my yard before I even finished my first cup of coffee. That wasn't just rude. It was suspicious. When I got home that evening, I found a thin, uneven strip of disturbed earth running diagonally across my front lawn like a scar. The grass had been sloppily replaced, and a literal sticky note was stuck to my door. It read, Routine MHRC infrastructure upgrade. Thank you for your understanding. No signature. No explanation. Just the assumption that I'd be fine with whatever they were doing. Spoiler, I wasn't. I left voicemails with the Maple Hollow Residential Council, MHRC, office, twice. I emailed them. No reply. Not even an auto-response. Things escalated when I called the city utilities department to ask what had been installed. A cheerful clerk pulled up my address and said, We don't have any new permits on file for your property, sir. I asked again. Same answer. I even asked if the HOA had filed anything under a neighborhood-wide infrastructure project. Still nothing. That's when two things became very clear. One, someone was lying. Two, they were probably standing on my lawn while doing it. The next morning, I spotted MHRC President Deborah Winslow strutting down the sidewalk in her salmon-pink windbreaker, clipboard in hand, sunglasses firmly in place, like she was inspecting her kingdom. She saw me standing next to the trench and offered a smile like we were in on some joke together. I didn't smile back. Deborah, I said, mind telling me what this is about? Oh, it's just a fiber optic line, she said breezily. We're upgrading the neighborhood's connectivity. It's a big win for everyone. Without asking, it's common property. It runs through everyone's yard. Except this yard, I replied. She gave me a patronizing chuckle. You signed the agreement, dear. Everyone in the MHRC did. There was just one problem with that. I didn't. Because I wasn't part of the HOA. See, here's the twist. My home was the original model home, built before Maple Hollow Reserve became a gated community. I bought it directly from the builder, years before Deborah and her clipboard army came into power. They tried to rope me in once, sent letters welcoming me to the HOA and outlining dues I never agreed to. The county confirmed it then and again recently. My home was grandfathered in, not under MHRC jurisdiction. In other words, my yard was not their playground. But clearly, Deborah either forgot, didn't care, or hoped I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I didn't lose it. Not yet. I'm a patient man. And besides, I like my revenge like I like my whiskey, slow and neat. But inside, I was already picturing the look on Deborah's face when this whole thing unraveled. I like my revenge the same way I like my whiskey, slow and neat. But even as I walked away from Deborah Winslow, Maple Hollow Residential Council president, I was already picturing her smug little grin collapsing in slow motion. I told her I'd be looking into it and turned on my heel before she could start quoting HOA bylaws like they were scripture from a clipboard gospel. That night, I sat at my desk with a mission. I pulled up every property record, plat map, utility permit, and HOA filing I could get my hands on. And there it was, in plain black and white text. No easement, no authorization, and absolutely zero legal documentation that allowed anyone to alter my property. The cable they ran through my yard wasn't just intrusive, it was illegal. So, I did what any former civil engineer with a grudge and a sense of justice would do. I documented everything. I took photos of the trench, measured its depth, and marked where the cable was exposed. I noted how poorly it had been buried, well under the minimum 12 inches required by code. It looked rushed, sloppy, like they never expected someone to fight back. I sent one final email to the MHRC, not to get a response, but to create a paper trail. No reply. Not even a bounce back. That silence only fueled my plan. Deborah Winslow had picked the wrong property, the wrong neighbor, and definitely the wrong guy. I wasn't going to let it slide. Just when I thought it couldn't get more absurd, a glossy, full-color MHRC bulletin showed up in my mailbox. Right there on page 1, a glowing message from Deborah herself. Thanks to your support, our new neighborhood fiber optic upgrade is live. Enjoy faster service at no additional cost to you. I nearly choked on my coffee. I hadn't gotten faster service. I hadn't even gotten a login. They built an entire system across my lawn that I couldn't legally use. And they did it without my permission. I smiled. Because unlike them, I knew exactly where the line was buried. And more importantly, I knew exactly where to dig. Before I tell you how that cable became a $12,000 invoice and sparked a civil war at Maple Hollow Reserve, let me tell you what happened the moment I grabbed my shovel. By the time I put blade to dirt, I had everything ready. Legal documents, property maps, photos, measurements. I even had a mental image of Deborah's expression the moment this unraveled. People like her operate on assumptions. She assumed no one would question her authority. She assumed I wouldn't know my rights. She assumed I'd roll over like some homeowner who cared more about mulch color than municipal code. What she didn't know, I had 6 years of civil engineering under my belt. I know how to read maps, file complaints, and calculate trench depth to the inch. I was one minor inconvenience away from going full trench warfare. Then came the push. 3 days after that HOA newsletter, I came home from the store to find another note taped to my front door. But this wasn't a sticky note. No, this was official. Printed on letterhead. Folded in an envelope like it came from royalty. Dear homeowner, failure to maintain the visual aesthetic of your lawn following infrastructure updates may result in penalties as outlined in the MHRC charter. Please resod the trench area promptly to ensure visual consistency. The audacity. Not only had they trespassed, buried unauthorized tech across my yard, and ghosted every attempt I made to communicate, but now they were fining me for not cleaning up their mess. I laughed, alone in my kitchen, cackling like a lunatic, holding that letter and grinning. Because if they wanted to play by the book, I had a whole damn library waiting. And page 1? It was about to be their worst nightmare. The next morning, I headed to the Redstone County Records office. No online form. No email. I wanted signed, stamped, physical papers in hand. Kenneth Chu, a tired-looking clerk with a coffee stain on his shirt, printed everything I needed: property lines, utility easements, subdivision maps. He even chuckled when I explained the situation. Yeah, that's not legal, he said flatly. No easement filed. They're gonna regret that. That was the first domino. And I was just getting started. I drove straight to the Redstone County Records office. Not a website. Not a phone call. I wanted physical papers in hand, signed and stamped, just in case things went nuclear. Kenneth Chu, the sleepy clerk behind the counter, wore a shirt with an old coffee stain and a badge that looked like it had been printed in the 90s. He didn't even blink when I explained the situation. Yeah, that's not legal, he muttered, flipping through one of the files. No easement on record for that trench. They're going to regret that. He printed everything I needed: property lines, utility easement history, subdivision plans. And just like that, I had the first domino. I went home and started snapping photos of the trench and the cable itself. I even lifted a piece of sod to show how shallow it had been buried 6 inches instead of the legally required 12. Probably a rush job. They didn't expect anyone to challenge them. They certainly didn't expect Caleb Mercer. Just to be thorough, I called my old buddy who still works for city infrastructure. He swung by with a voltage tester, checked the line, and confirmed it was active fiber, not capped off, not decommissioned. It was live. The kicker? It wasn't properly insulated against ground moisture. One bad rainstorm, and it would have corroded like spaghetti. I had enough evidence to take this to court. But lawsuits are expensive. Petty revenge, however, is practically free. So I marked the line with red utility flags and waited for Saturday. Nothing suspicious about yard work on a weekend, right? I invited a few friends over for beers and barbecue, and we made an afternoon out of it. burgers, music, and a 6-foot trench across my lawn. Every time someone asked what we were digging, I just smiled and said, cleaning up the mess the MHRC left. They said it's my lawn to restore, after all. Eventually, I found it, a thick black cable exactly where I expected. I followed it until I reached the connection box, a small gray metal enclosure half buried under mulch. No lock. No warnings. Just sitting there like it was daring me. One satisfying twist of a wrench, and the entire cable was disconnected. No, I didn't cut it. I'm not a criminal. I simply removed unauthorized equipment from my property, like pulling weeds or replacing a busted sprinkler. All I did was clean up my yard. 15 minutes later, the neighborhood's internet collapsed like a dying star. At first, I didn't notice. Then my phone started lighting up with messages from neighbors. Is your Wi-Fi down? Did you lose internet too? What the hell happened? I just kept grilling. Then came the queen herself. Deborah Winslow stormed across my yard like a hurricane in pearls, flanked by 2 MHRC board members and a pair of guys in khakis holding laptops like they were defusing bombs. She was shouting into her phone, or trying to, because it wasn't working. The irony was thick enough to pave my driveway with. She spotted me leaning on my shovel and pointed like she was invoking divine wrath. What did you do? I tilted my head. Sorry. What? The network. The internet. We have a critical infrastructure outage. I looked around. I'm just doing some landscaping. MHRC said I was responsible for restoring the lawn. You even sent me a letter. Her face twisted like she bit into a lemon. She shouted about vandalism, consequences, and legal action. I ignored her, walked into the house, and returned with a manila envelope. Inside, printed photos, a map, a copy of my property deed, a letter signed by my attorney Jordan Price, and, most importantly, a bill. Itemized. Lawn restoration, $2,400. Fence repair, trench cracked one of my posts, $1,200. Property devaluation due to unauthorized construction, $8,400, based on legal precedent. Total, $12,000. Due in 30 days. Failure to pay would result in legal action, including a lien against MHRC's common assets. Deborah snatched the envelope, flipped through the pages, and made the worst possible move. She laughed. Nice try, she said. You think we're going to pay you 12 grand because you dug up our line? No, I replied. You're going to pay me because I can prove you broke the law. One of the board members pulled her aside, whispering frantically. The look on Deborah's face started to change. And that was just the beginning. The MHRC board members pulled Deborah Winslow aside. They started whispering furiously, and while I couldn't make out every word, I caught enough to know they were sweating. Apparently, no one had actually filed the required permits for the fiber line installation. The contractor they hired was supposed to handle that kind of paperwork, only they didn't. And now their shiny connectivity upgrade sat like a dead snake in my front yard, unplugged, unpermitted, and very, very illegal. Deborah whipped back around toward me with narrowed eyes, her voice icy. You're going to regret this. I wiped my hands on a towel. I doubt it. But you might regret not checking your mail tomorrow. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already CC'd Redstone County. A formal complaint had been filed, with supporting documents, photographs, and a certified letter en route. Receipt required. And then came the next act in this drama, the cops. The next morning, I was halfway through resodding my torn-up lawn, headphones in, listening to some classic Zeppelin, when a shadow crossed my shovel. I looked up to see 2 officers, one older guy with a to-go coffee cup, the other younger, clearly new to the badge. They weren't aggressive, just wearing that "we don't know what we're walking into" posture cops learn early. Good morning, the older one said, polite but firm. Are you the homeowner? I nodded, still calm. Yes, sir. Before I could ask why they were there, I saw her, Deborah Winslow, marching down the street like a general leading her last desperate charge. She had on dark sunglasses, lips tight, and a manila folder stuffed so full it looked ready to explode. 2 MHRC board members trailed behind her, noticeably less enthusiastic than before. Probably because they knew exactly what kind of mess they were walking into. Deborah wasted no time. She pointed at me like I was public enemy number 1 and launched into a breathless rant. He tampered with critical infrastructure. He disrupted essential neighborhood utilities. He's endangering the whole community. She waved some photocopied MHRC document like it was a court order. The younger cop looked confused. The older one just kept sipping his coffee and turned to me. Mind telling us your side? Sure, I said. I walked to the porch and grabbed an envelope I'd prepared ahead of time. Inside, my deed, county records, a printout from Officer Marcus Bell at City Infrastructure showing no permits had been filed, an email chain showing my repeated attempts to contact MHRC, photos, timestamps, you name it. I laid it out on the hood of their patrol car. The older officer flipped through the paperwork and raised an eyebrow. So you're not part of the MHRC? Nope. Never have been. They keep pretending I am, though. And this trench? This fiber line? They installed it without your permission. Correct. No permit, no easement, and they buried it way too shallow. Then they had the nerve to fine me for not fixing their mess. Deborah tried to cut in, her voice shrill, waving her folder again. But the younger officer, bless him, asked the million-dollar question. Ma'am, do you have a copy of the permit for this installation? That shut her up. For a beat, she blinked, then muttered something about the contractor being responsible for all that. The officer pressed again. So the MHRC didn't file any formal request with the city or get approval from the homeowner before digging? Deborah looked to the board members for support. They stared at the sidewalk like it was the most fascinating thing they'd ever seen. One of them finally mumbled, "We assumed it was covered under community improvement projects." The older officer calmly handed Deborah her stack of papers back. Assumptions aren't permits. That was the moment her face lost all color. She tried to pivot, of course. Started rambling about community betterment and neighborhood safety, but the damage was done. The officers made it clear this was a civil matter, and from what they could see, I had every right to remove what had been illegally installed on my own property. It was the first time in weeks that I felt the tide turn. I didn't gloat. Didn't need to. Because sometimes, the law doesn't just speak. It grinds slowly, and in this case, it was grinding right over Deborah's clipboard kingdom. The officers left without issuing any citations or warnings. In fact, the older one even gave me a subtle nod as he headed back to the patrol car, like he was silently rooting for me. Deborah Winslow, on the other hand, stood rooted to the spot like she couldn't quite process what had just unfolded. She muttered something about contacting legal and stormed off in a cloud of indignation, her clipboard cavalry scrambling to catch up. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, I received an envelope with the sort of faux formal seriousness only a mid-tier law office could muster. It was a cease and desist letter, accusing me of willful destruction of MHRC property and demanding immediate payment for fiber line repair. It was laughably bad. Passive-aggressive tone, vague legal threats, and not a single accurate citation. If you're going to try intimidation, at least hire someone who knows what the word easement means. Instead of responding directly, I forwarded it to Jordan Price, my attorney friend. He read it, laughed, then drafted a response that was half professional scorched earth and half legal masterclass. We reattached all prior documentation, my deed, the city permits, or lack thereof, email logs, trench photos, and included a little reminder that if the MHRC chose to escalate this matter, we would happily open discovery. That meant depositions, internal board communications, and financial records related to the unauthorized project. We wrapped it up by restating my $112,000 invoice and concluded with a line that read, "We strongly recommend payment be rendered promptly to avoid further liability." A week passed. Nothing. 2 weeks. Silence. Then, a new development arrived, not via threats, but in the form of a community-wide flyer. An emergency MHRC board meeting, open to all residents, was being held at the Maple Hollow Community Center. The agenda: infrastructure concerns and board transparency. Translation: damage control. I showed up, not because I cared about the speeches, but because I wanted to see the fallout with my own eyes. The place was packed. People who hadn't been to a meeting in years were suddenly eager for answers. Some were angry, others confused, and many just wanted to know why their internet was still out. The moment Deborah stepped up to the microphone, you could feel the tension. Her usual polished veneer had cracked. She tried to deliver some half-baked line about streamlining communications and unforeseen installation challenges, but the crowd wasn't buying it. A man in the back stood up and asked bluntly, "Why is my internet still down if you said the system was fully upgraded?" A woman in the front chimed in, "Who approved trenching across our yards? I never gave permission." Another voice added, "How did you even select the contractor? Was there a bid process?" Questions piled up until Deborah was visibly sweating, fumbling through pages of notes that weren't helping. And then the rail bomb dropped. A neighbor, Greg Sanders, a contractor himself, stood up and calmly said he had pulled his property records, just like I had. Turns out, his home and several others had been built before the Maple Hollow Residential Council was formally chartered. They had been bluffing their jurisdiction for years. Nobody had bothered to verify until now. The room went dead quiet. Deborah's face drained of color. By the end of the meeting, the board was fractured, the community was furious, and the truth was clear. Deborah had been ruling a kingdom built on assumptions and photocopied bylaws. I didn't need to speak. I just sat with my arms crossed in the back, enjoying the implosion. After that, silence. No letters. No emails. Not even a knock at the door. Then, 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. Inside, a check for the full $112,000. No apology. No memo. Just a cold, clean payment. You'd think that would be the end, but you'd be wrong. Because about a month later, when I had finally started to relax, I pulled into my driveway to find something surreal. A new crew on my lawn. Same trenching equipment. Same orange flags. Different uniforms, sure, but the same smug clipboard-wielding supervisor. The fiber line was back. And just like that, round 2 had begun. At first, I thought it was a joke. One last act of spite from Deborah Winslow before she vanished into whatever Pacific Northwest gated enclave she'd set her sights on. But no. About a month after I'd received the $112,000 check and assumed we were finally done with trench warfare, I came home to find a new crew standing on my lawn. Different uniforms, sure, but the same orange flags. The same smug supervisor with a clipboard barking orders. The same blatant disregard for the fact that they were standing on private property they had no right to touch, as if I were a lawn ornament instead of a homeowner. I marched right over and asked, calmly but firmly, what they were doing. The guy in charge, Troy Hansen, according to his embroidered patch, didn't flinch. We're reinstalling the fiber line per the HOA's new easement agreement, he said flatly. I blinked. Then I laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A deep, absurd, can't believe this is real kind of laugh. What easement agreement? I asked. Because I sure didn't sign anything. No one contacted me. And unless I've developed amnesia, no legal document exists that gives you permission to be here. He shrugged. Gave me a number for his supervisor, which went straight to voicemail. Not my problem, sir. I'm just following orders. Classic. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just turned and walked back inside, sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and got to work. First call. Redstone County Office. Kenneth Chu confirmed what I already suspected, still no permit. Second step. I pulled up the latest MHRC bulletin. There it was, buried in the last paragraph on page 3, a vague announcement about network reinstatement efforts. No addresses, no contact info. Just bureaucratic fluff meant to sound official. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about the cable. They were trying to set a precedent. If they got it back in the ground and operational, they could argue it was now utility infrastructure and under some loophole, force the issue legally. It was straight out of Deborah's passive-aggressive war manual. Don't confront. Just exhaust. Too bad for them. I don't exhaust. I escalate. So I waited. I let them finish. Let them trench. Let them patch the grass. And then, I made 2 calls. First, to Officer Marcus Bell at City Infrastructure Compliance. Within 2 hours, he was in my driveway, clipboard in hand. He measured trench depth, reviewed notes, and started scribbling violations, improper installation, no permits, shallow burial. I handed him the previous letter from MHRC's legal team. He frowned. They're going to love this downtown, he muttered. Second call, Jordan Price. My lawyer. We drafted a far less cordial letter this time. It outlined repeated trespassing, the intentional reinstallation of unauthorized infrastructure, and an attempt to fabricate a legal easement where none existed. We demanded full removal within 72 hours and tacked on an updated invoice for $1,800 for new damages, labor, and legal consultation. We made it crystal clear. Fail to comply, and we'd file in civil court. No reply. But this time, their silence wasn't arrogance. It was fear. Because the inspector's report had made its rounds. The city was now considering fines. An internal review had started. And homeowners were beginning to whisper, angry whispers that turned into phone calls, then neighborhood group threads, and finally, public demands for accountability. It only took 3 days. Then came the shockwave. Deborah Winslow, president of the Maple Hollow Residential Council, resigned. Officially? Personal reasons. Unofficially? The pressure finally broke her. Turns out, she hadn't informed half the board about the second installation. She acted solo, assuming no one would dig too deep, literally or legally. She assumed wrong. Deborah Winslow had acted unilaterally, hoping her bold move would go unnoticed or, better yet, celebrated as a forward-thinking infrastructure victory. But it didn't work, not even close. The same neighbors who once nodded politely at her directives were now demanding receipts, accountability, and metaphorically, her head on a silver platter. Then came the fallout. The contractor responsible for the second illegal fiber installation was hit with multiple citations, digging without a permit, failing utility safety checks, you name it. The real kicker? One of the crew members cracked under questioning and admitted they were told not to engage with the homeowner if questioned. That revelation gave Officer Marcus Bell and the city's compliance department all the leverage they needed. Within days, the entire fiber line was declared unauthorized and ordered to be removed in full. But here's where the storm started to clear. Monica Reyes, the newly elected president of the Maple Hollow Residential Council, showed up on my doorstep in person. She was nervous, sincere, and clearly mortified by what her predecessor had left behind. She apologized, handed me a check for the additional $4,800 in damages, and assured me that under her leadership, nothing like this would ever happen again. I nodded, took the check, and handed her a pre-typed letter I'd drafted the night before. It was direct. Any future attempts to install infrastructure on my property without written consent would result in immediate legal action. I also made it crystal clear that I would not, under any circumstances, accept retroactive inclusion in the MHRC. And just for good measure, I'd had it notarized. Monica accepted the letter with grace, thanked me for my time, and walked away with more dignity than Deborah ever managed. That should have been the end. The MHRC lost. Deborah was gone. The trench was filled, the lawn restored, and the cable removed. I had my money and my property rights back. But the truth? I still get neighbors stopping me at the mailbox asking, "How'd you pull it off?" Some want to know about the law, others about the nerve. And the answer's always the same. It wasn't about rage or pride. It was about principle. You don't just stroll into someone's yard and start digging because you think you can. You don't steamroll someone who reads contracts for fun and once threatened to sue an airline over mislabeled overhead bin space. Maybe I was a little extra. Maybe I could have let it slide. But every time I see that smooth, perfect stretch of lawn, I smile. Because it's not just grass. It's a line. And when someone tries to bury power in your yard, you don't just dig it up. You make them pay for the shovel, too.